The wind that November evening carried more than cold. It carried the weight of 32 years, the echo of choices made in desperation, and the ghost of a man who had died in the snow, only to be resurrected by the hands of a woman who should never have touched him. Nathaniel Blackwell sat in his leather chair beside the granite fireplace, watching the flames dance against stone that had witnessed 3 decades of his life. At 64, his body bore the map of survival. Silver hair, neatly trimmed beard, hands scarred from labor that no railway heir should have known. His right hand rested on a hickory cane polished smooth by a decade of use, a gift from his son Thomas on a birthday Nathaniel had stopped counting. Beside him, cross-legged on the bearskin rug that had seen births and deaths and everything between, sat his grandson. William was 16, all sharp angles and unformed questions, with eyes the same glacial blue that had looked back at Nathaniel from mirrors for 64 years. The boy had just asked a question that made the old man fall silent, and in that silence the wind outside sang its ancient song. "Grandfather," William said again, softer this time, as if he sensed he had touched something sacred. "Why didn't you ever go back to Boston? Father says the Blackwell family owns half the railways west of the Mississippi. You could be one of the richest men in America." Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He looked past his grandson through the tall windows that framed the Bighorn Basin in twilight purple to where snow had begun to fall, fat, lazy flakes that drifted like ash from heaven. The first snow of the season, arriving exactly as it had arrived 32 years ago on the night his old life ended and his real life began. "You want to know why I stayed here?" Nathaniel said, finally, his voice the texture of river stones grinding together. "Why I chose this mountain over an empire." William nodded, eager and young, and still believing that wealth measured worth. Nathaniel reached to the side table, his movements careful, deliberate. His shoulders still ached when the barometric pressure dropped a souvenir from the day a judge tried to kill the woman he loved. From the drawer he withdrew a leather-bound journal, the cover worn soft as prayer, the pages yellowed at the edges like old photographs. "This," Nathaniel said, holding it with both hands as if it were made of glass, "was your grandmother's. She wrote in it from 1888 to 1893. Every night after your father was asleep, she would sit by this very fire and record what she remembered, what we survived." He opened it, and the smell of old ink and older memories rose between them. "I'm going to tell you a story, William. The story of a man who died in a blizzard and a woman who taught him how to live again. But before I begin, you must promise me something. You will listen to the end. You will not interrupt. You will not judge until you have heard it all. Can you promise me that?" The boy nodded, solemn, now sensing the gravity in his grandfather's voice. Nathaniel settled deeper into his chair. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell harder, and for a moment he was not 64 but 32, not warm but freezing, not safe but hunted. "It begins," Nathaniel said, "with a woman named Grace." Sister Grace Hartley had not chosen God. God, in his infinite and occasionally cruel wisdom, had chosen her. Or so she had believed on that November night in 1888, when she walked into the private wing of St. Catherine's Convent and found Judge Howard Crane strangling a 19-year-old girl who was carrying his child. Grace was 27 that year. 27 years of living, 6 years of serving, and in the span of 5 heartbeats, everything she had built upon the foundation of prayer and penance shattered like ice on stone. She had been the daughter of a military doctor. Jonathan Hartley had served in the war between the states, had stitched men back together in field hospitals where the screaming never stopped and the blood ran in rivers. When he returned home to his wife and infant daughter, he carried his surgical kit and his demons with equal weight. Grace's mother died giving birth to her, a fact her father never spoke of, but Grace always knew, could see in the way he looked at her, sometimes love and loss fighting for dominance in his tired eyes. He raised her alone, taught her to read from medical texts because he had no other books, taught her anatomy by lamplight, drawing organs and bones on scraps of paper, explaining circulation and respiration in the same gentle voice other fathers used for bedtime stories. By the time Grace was 12, she could set a broken bone. By 15, she could suture a wound with stitches so neat they left barely a scar. Her father died when she was 21. Consumption took him, slowly gave him time to make her promise that she would use her skills for good, that she would heal the hurting, that she would never let her gift go to waste. 3 months after they buried him, Grace walked into St. Catherine's convent and asked to take vows. The Mother Superior, a practical woman who valued competence over piety, accepted her immediately. The convent needed someone who understood medicine, who could tend to the poor, and the beaten women who came seeking sanctuary. For 6 years, Grace served. She wore the habit, spoke the prayers, kept her hands busy, and her heart quiet. She told herself she had found peace. She told herself the ache of loneliness was the cost of devotion. She told herself many things that were lies dressed in religious language. And then came November 8th, 1888. Mother Superior summoned her at 10 in the evening, an hour when the convent should have been silent, with sleep and vespers. Grace found the older woman standing outside the private wing, the place where guests of means and discretion were housed when they needed the church's protection or silence. "Sister Grace," Mother Superior said, and there was something in her voice that made Grace's healer instincts sharpen. "We have a visitor, a young woman in distress. She requires your particular skills. Discretion is paramount." Grace nodded. She had tended to many such visitors. Women fleeing violent husbands, women carrying children born of shame or force, women whose bodies bore the evidence of men's cruelty. She gathered her medical kit, the one her father had left her, its leather case worn soft with use, its instruments still sharp and true. The room smelled of fear and expensive cologne. Grace noticed that first. Then she noticed the girl on the bed, small and blonde and shaking. Then she noticed the man standing over her, and the world tilted on its axis. Judge Howard Crane was 55 years old, white-haired, impeccably dressed even at this late hour. He sat on the Supreme Court of Wyoming Territory. He donated generously to the church. He was by all accounts a pillar of righteousness. He was also at that precise moment strangling Margaret Brooks with both hands, while she clawed weakly at his wrists and made a sound like a dying rabbit. Grace did not scream. Women who grew up watching their fathers amputate limbs without anesthesia learned early not to waste breath on screaming. Instead, she looked around the room with the cold calculation of a battlefield surgeon assessing resources. On the nightstand sat a ceramic pitcher, heavy with holy water, perhaps 5 pounds of blessed weight. Grace crossed the room in 4 strides. She lifted the pitcher with both hands. She brought it down on the back of Judge Crane's skull with every ounce of strength her father had taught her to channel when setting difficult bones or holding down thrashing patients. The sound was wet and final. Ceramic met bone. Crane dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Margaret fell from the bed onto the floor, gasping, her throat already bruising in the shape of hands. Grace knelt beside her fingers, finding the girl's pulse, her trained eyes scanning for injuries. Margaret's lips moved, forming words that came out as barely a whisper. "He promised. Help me, baby. Now he..." Silence. Behind them, the door flew open. Grace spun, still on her knees, still holding the broken pitcher handle like a weapon. The man in the doorway wore a deputy's badge. 26 years old, narrow-faced eyes that had seen too much and not enough all at once. But there was recognition in those eyes when they fell on Margaret. Recognition and horror and rage. "Maggie," his voice broke on the name. "Oh God, Maggie." Deputy Samuel Brooks fell to his knees beside his sister, because that's what she was. Margaret Brooks, 19 years old, 4 months pregnant, missing for 3 weeks. Samuel had been searching, had followed a trail of rumors and bribes and whispered confessions that led him to Judge Crane, to the convent, to this room, to this moment. He was too late by about 30 seconds. Margaret died in her brother's arms. Not from the strangulation, though the bruises would suggest otherwise to anyone who didn't know better. She died from internal bleeding, from injuries sustained earlier, from the violence that had been done to her before Grace arrived. The baby died with her never having drawn a single breath. Samuel Brooks held his sister and made no sound at all, which was somehow worse than screaming. Grace stood slowly. Her hands shook now, delayed shock setting in. On the floor, Judge Crane groaned and stirred, not dead, merely stunned. Blood matted his white hair where the pitcher had connected. Samuel looked up at Grace, looked at Crane, made a decision that would alter the course of 3 lives. "Run," he said quietly. "Sister, you need to run, right now." "I can testify," Grace said. "I saw him. I saw what he did." Samuel laughed, and it was the saddest sound Grace had ever heard. "You think testimony matters against a Supreme Court judge? You think anyone will believe a nun over him?" He'll say you attacked him. He'll say Margaret was hysterical, that you're unstable, that you stole from the convent pharmacy to feed an addiction. As if to prove the point, Crane's eyes fluttered open, focused on Grace, focused on Samuel. Even dazed and bleeding, the judge's mind worked with terrible clarity. "Assault," Crane croaked. "Theft, she's mad. Arrest her." Samuel reached into Crane's coat pocket as the judge tried weakly to stop him, pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, the kind merchants use for accounting, flipped it open. His face went white. "Take this," Samuel said, pressing the ledger into Grace's hands. "Hide it. It's evidence, proof of what he's done. But not here, not now. He owns Wyoming's sister. Every sheriff, every judge, every lawman answers to him or his money. Where do I go?" "North Montana Territory, as far as you can get." Grace looked at the ledger, looked at Margaret's body, looked at Crane, who was already reaching for the bell pull to summon help to start the machinery of his power moving. She made her choice. Grace stripped off her habit in the room she'd called home for 6 years. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton dress, gray and unremarkable. She took the ledger. She took 3 vials of morphine from the medical cabinet, knowing she might need them for pain or mercy, hoping for neither. She took her father's surgical kit because a healer never traveled without tools. She walked out of St. Catherine's Convent at midnight, and with every step she felt the weight of broken vows pressing against her spine like a cross made of guilt. By dawn, she had paid a stagecoach driver $4, her last money in the world, to take her north toward Montana. By sunset, the blizzard hit. They called it the Great Blizzard of 1888, though those who lived through it had other names. The White Death, the Frozen Hell, the storm that ate the West. It began on November 12th with a drop in temperature so sudden that cattle froze standing up. Within an hour, the wind rose to 80 miles per hour. Within 2 hours, 4 feet of snow had fallen. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze breath in lungs, to turn exposed skin black with frostbite in minutes, to kill the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. Grace was unprepared. The stagecoach overturned 10 miles into the Bighorn Basin. One moment they were moving through heavy snow, the next the world tipped sideways and gravity became a weapon. Wood splintered, metal shrieked. The driver's neck snapped with a sound like a branch breaking. The horses screamed once and bolted into the white, taking survival with them. Grace crawled from the wreckage. Her left shoulder sang with pain where she had struck something solid. Her boots, secondhand and purchased in Cheyenne for $1.50, were already splitting at the seams. She had no coat heavy enough for this cold, no supplies beyond what she carried in her father's medical kit, no destination except away. She walked because staying still meant dying. Walked because the human body, that marvelous machine her father had taught her to understand, would keep moving long past the point where the mind gave up. The wind howled like something alive and hungry. The snow fell so thick she could not see her own hands when she held them before her face. 14 hours. That's how long Grace walked. 14 hours in which her feet went from painful to numb to eerily silent, the sensation in her toes simply ceasing as if they had been amputated without her knowledge. 14 hours in which hunger became a living thing, gnawing at her stomach, having eaten nothing but a crust of bread in 2 days. 14 hours in which she prayed and cursed and prayed again, the words running together into a litany of survival. "Father in heaven, who art in nowhere, give us this day our daily breath. Forgive us our trespasses as we freeze those who trespass against us." She fell more times than she could count, got up fewer times than she fell. Her shoulder was not bruised, she realized with the detached clarity of medical training. It was fractured. Hairline probably, maybe just a deep crack, but enough that each breath pulled sharp and specific pain across her left side. 3 of her toes were frostbitten. She could tell without looking, could feel the absence where feelings should be, knew from her father's teachings that the tissue was dying even as she walked. She was going to die here, in this white emptiness. 27 years old, died fleeing justice. That wasn't justice, died with a murderer's ledger clutched to her chest and the weight of broken vows around her neck like a noose. Grace knelt in the snow. It was surprisingly warm. That's what hypothermia did, her father's voice lectured from memory. Made you think you were warm when you were freezing. Made you want to sleep when sleep meant death. made you believe peace was just a moment of surrender away. She was ready to surrender. Then she heard the gunshot. It cracked across the valley like the voice of God, sharp and unmistakable, and completely incongruous with the desolate white. Grace's head snapped up. A gunshot meant a person. A person meant shelter. Shelter meant life. She forced herself to stand, forced her legs to move, followed the echo of that single shot up a ridge that seemed impossibly steep, her hand clawing at frozen bark, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. At the top of the ridge, she saw it. A cabin sat in a hollow between the two massive granite peaks built of stone and timber, like something from a fairy tale. Smoke pouring thick and aggressive from a chimney that promised heat, promised fire, promised salvation. But the snow in front of the heavy oak door was not white. It was dark, red, blood on snow impossible to mistake. Grace did not have the strength to knock. She fell against the door. The latch gave. She collapsed onto rough-hewn floorboards, bringing the blizzard in with her like an unwelcome guest. Heat hit her first, overwhelming, suffocating heat after so long in the cold. It smelled of pine resin and stale tobacco and something else, something copper and organic and wrong. Blood, fresh blood. Grace coughed, her body shuddering as warmth began the painful process of thawing frozen flesh. She blinked, her eyes open. She was lying on a bearskin rug. The door had closed behind her, somehow shutting out the storm. Firelight danced against log walls. Dried meat hung from the rafters. Books lined shelves. Weapons gleamed on racks, and in a massive leather chair beside the fire sat a man who looked like he was trying very hard not to die. "You ain't the Reaper," the man said, his voice deep and grinding, like tectonic plates shifting. "Reaper walks quieter." Grace pushed herself up on trembling arms, looked at him properly. He was enormous. Even seated, he gave the impression of vast size of barely contained violence. Perhaps 6 feet 4 inches, perhaps 300 pounds broad across the shoulders and chest in a way that spoke of genetics and hard labor in equal measure. He wore buckskins dark with grease and age. His chest was bare beneath an open shirt, revealing a topography of scars and fresh blood. Just below his left ribs, a hole oozed dark red. Entry wound, no exit. The bullet was still inside. His face was half hidden by a beard matted with blood and sweat, but his eyes were visible. Blue, not sky blue or ocean blue, but glacial blue. The blue of ice 1,000 years old, the blue of frozen lakes that held darkness beneath. Those eyes were fever bright and fixed on her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. In his right hand, wavering between Grace and the fireplace, he held a Colt .45 Peacemaker. The barrel shook with the tremor of a man fighting shock and blood loss. "I'm a healer," Grace said, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. I am Sister Grace Hartley, St. Catherine's Convent." The man laughed. It came out wet and wheezing and ended in a groan of pain. "A nun in my cabin, God's got a sick sense of humor." "You're dying," Grace said, medical assessment overriding fear. She could see the pool of blood beneath his chair, could calculate the loss, could read the signs of sepsis beginning in the flush of his skin and the glaze of his eyes. "That wound, if infection doesn't kill you, blood loss will. You have maybe an hour." "Who sent you?" The gun steadied slightly, found her face. "Crane, that mining syndicate. Who paid you to find me?" The name Crane hit Grace like a physical blow. She stared at this dying stranger in his mountain fortress. "No one sent me. I ran from Crane. He killed a girl. I hit him with a pitcher. There's a warrant for my arrest." Something shifted in those glacial eyes. The gun lowered an inch. "Crane," the man repeated, and the name in his mouth was a curse. "Howard Crane, Supreme Court judge, richest bastard in Wyoming. You know him." "I know what he is." They stared at each other across the space of the cabin, two fugitives, two people running from power they could not fight alone. "Why should I trust you?" the man asked. "Because you'll be dead in an hour without me," Grace said with the blunt honesty her father had taught her to employ with dying patients. "And I'll freeze in 3 hours without your fire. We can die separately, or we can try to live together." The man studied her, tried to lift the gun one more time. His strength failed. The heavy iron dropped to the floor with a thud that echoed in the small space. His eyes rolled back. He slumped sideways. Grace didn't think. She crawled to him, her own legs barely working, checked his pulse with fingers that knew exactly where to find the beat of life. Thready, fast, 120 beats per minute when it should have been 60. She looked around the cabin with a surgeon's eye. Cast iron kettle on the hearth, jars of moonshine on shelves, hunting knives on the table, dried meat hanging like strange fruit, books scattered everywhere, Shakespeare and legal commentaries and engineering texts, suggesting this was no ordinary hermit. She needed hot water. She needed a blade. She needed whiskey to sterilize and steady her hands. For the next 4 hours, Sister Grace Hartley ceased being a fugitive and became what her father had trained her to be, a healer who did not choose her patients but healed them anyway. She dragged the massive man across the floor to the bearskin rug near the fire. He weighed close to 300 pounds of dead weight. It took her 20 minutes and left her gasping, her fractured shoulder screaming. She tore strips from his buckskin shirt to bind the area around the wound. She filled the kettle with snow and hung it over the fire to boil. While the water heated, she sterilized a hunting knife, 10-inch blade carbon steel, wicked sharp. She held it in the flames until the metal glowed red, 1400 degrees of purification. Set it aside to cool to 800 degrees, still hot enough to kill any living thing on its surface. She washed her hands in moonshine. 120 proof, 60% alcohol, strong enough to strip paint or sterilize flesh. The burn was purifying. Then she knelt beside the man and began to cut. The wound was 3 inches below his left rib cage, the bullet lodged deep in muscle tissue, possibly touching the liver. Grace poured boiling water over the area, watched his unconscious body jerk, followed with moonshine. His back arched. She made her first incision. Blood welled up, dark red venous. She worked quickly, her father's training, moving her hands with practiced precision. 2 inches deep into tissue, feeling with her fingers for the foreign object. The human body was a landscape she knew well, had studied in drawings and cadavers, but never like this, never with her hands inside a living person, never with life and death balanced on her skill. 45 minutes into the surgery, the man woke up. His eyes snapped open, focused on Grace, on the knife in her hand, on his own blood covering her arms. He roared. The sound was not human. It was something primal, something that belonged to the mountains and the predators that ruled them. His fist swung with the blind panic of a wounded animal. The blow caught Grace across the shoulder, the fractured shoulder, and sent her flying into the log wall. Her back hit wood. Air exploded from her lungs. Stars burst behind her eyes. But she did not stop. Grace crawled back. The man was thrashing now, trying to sit up, trying to escape the pain he did not understand. She threw her weight across his arm, used her knee to pin it to the floor, a restraint technique her father had taught her for holding down soldiers during amputations. "Stay still." Her voice cracked like a whip. "I'm almost there. Stay still or you'll kill us both." She dove back into the wound. Her fingers, slippery with blood, found the bullet. Metal on metal, the slug clicking against her father's forceps that she'd found in the cabin's sparse medical supplies. She clamped down, pulled slowly, steadily, feeling resistance and then release. The flattened .44 caliber bullet dropped into a tin cup with a sound like a church bell. Grace grabbed the knife she had set aside, still hot from the fire, placed the flat of the blade against the wound. The sizzle of cauterization filled the cabin, followed by the smell of burning flesh, a smell that would haunt her dreams for decades. She stitched the wound with 20-pound fishing line, the only thread she could find. 23 stitches, surgeon's knots, precise and tight. When she finished, the man's breathing had steadied. His pulse had slowed to 90 beats per minute. Grace sat back. She was covered in his blood and her own sweat. Her shoulder throbbed. Her hands shook with delayed shock. But the man would live. She had saved him. She tried to stand to get water to tend to her own injuries. The room spun violently. The adrenaline that had carried her through surgery crashed like a wave breaking. Hunger forgotten during the operation roared back with savage intensity. She saw a strip of elk jerky on the table 10 feet away. Might as well have been 10 miles. She reached for it anyway. Her fingers brushed the edge. Darkness took her before she could grasp it. Grace woke to warmth pressing against her lips. The command was low and harsh, but lacked the aggression from before. "Swallow." She opened her mouth. Warm broth rich with fat and salt trickled down her throat. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, better than communion wine, better than holy water, better than answered prayers. She choked, coughed, swallowed more, opened her eyes. The giant was leaning over her, holding a wooden spoon, feeding her from a bowl of stew that smelled of elk and wild onions. He looked pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he was upright, alive. Grace found herself lying in the cabin's only bed, covered with thick fur blankets that weighed like comfort itself. The man sat on a rough stool beside her, the bowl steady in hands that could have crushed it like kindling. "Slow down," he grunted when she tried to gulp the broth. "You'll vomit if you rush." Grace pushed herself up on her elbows. Pain lanced through her shoulder. She gasped. "Your shoulder," the man said. "Hairline fracture. I bound it while you slept." She looked down. Someone had wrapped her shoulder in clean cloth, professional and tight. The man saw her confusion. "I know some field medicine," he said quietly. "Enough to recognize what you did for me." Grace's medical mind cataloged his condition. Color better. Breathing steady, wound redressed with fresh bandages. He had taken care of himself despite the injuries she had just inflicted and healed. "You saved my life," the man said. It was not a question. "You would have died," Grace replied. "I'm a healer. It's what I do. Even for strangers who pointed guns at you. Especially for them." The ghost of a smile touched the man's bearded face. It transformed him, softening the harsh lines around his eyes, revealing something almost gentle beneath the violence. "Name's Nathaniel," he said after a moment. "Folks in town call me other things. Mostly they don't come near enough to call me anything." "Grace," she replied. "Sister Grace Hartley, though I suppose I'm not much of a sister anymore." "Folks in town call you wanted, I'm guessing. If there's still a town to do the calling." Nathaniel ladled another spoonful of broth into her mouth. The domesticity of the act was strange and comforting in equal measure. "Crane," Nathaniel said, and the name hung in the air between them like smoke. "Howard Crane, Supreme Court judge. He's got reach, power, money enough to buy silence or violence as needed." "I know," Grace whispered. "He killed a girl, Margaret Brooks, 19 years old, pregnant with his child. He strangled her to keep her quiet. And you witnessed it." "I tried to stop it. I hit him with a pitcher. Her brother was there. Deputy Samuel Brooks. He told me to run. Said Crane would bury me if I stayed." Nathaniel set the bowl down, stood wincing as his stitches pulled, walked to the window and looked out at the white world beyond. "Storm dropped 4 feet of snow," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Grace heard the weight beneath the words. "The pass is closed. Nobody's getting in or out of Blackwood Ridge for a month, maybe more." He turned back to her. The firelight caught his eyes, made them glow like ice lit from within. "You're stuck here, Grace, with me, a man you don't know, in a one-room cabin, for at least 30 days. Grace's throat tightened. She thought of her vows, of the habits she had stripped away, of the life she had abandoned in the space of a single night. "I took vows," she said quietly. "I'm not supposed to be alone with a man. I'm not supposed to—" She trailed off. The impossibility of her situation settled over her like the weight of the snow outside. Nathaniel crossed back to her, knelt beside the bed so their eyes were level. Up close, she could see the scars that mapped his face beneath the beard. Old violence. Survived trauma. "I won't touch you," Nathaniel said, and his voice carried the weight of an oath. "You saved my life. I owe you that much. I'll sleep on the floor. You keep the bed. When the pass opens, I'll guide you to Montana myself. Help you disappear." "Why?" Grace asked. "Why would you do that for me?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moaned its endless song. "Because I know what it's like to run from powerful men," he said finally, "and because you didn't have to save me, but you did anyway." They looked at each other across the small distance between bed and floor, two people who should never have met, bound now by blood and desperation and the simple fact of survival. "Get some sleep," Nathaniel said, standing. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Your body needs rest." 3 days. Grace's mind spun. 3 days of vulnerability. 3 days during which this stranger could have done anything. Instead, he had fed her, bound her wounds, given her his only bed. As Nathaniel settled onto the bearskin rug by the fire, arranging himself with careful movements that favored his stitched side, Grace lay back against the furs. She should pray, should ask forgiveness for her broken vows, her abandoned calling, her presence in this cabin with this man. Instead, she whispered into the darkness, "Forgive me, Father, for I have broken an enclosure. I have touched a man's flesh. I have felt safe. Is safety a sin when it comes from the hand of a stranger?" No answer came but the crackling of fire and the steady breathing of the man who had every reason to be her enemy and had instead become, through the strange alchemy of necessity, something else entirely. The first week passed in a rhythm older than civilization itself, tending wounds, sharing food, learning the boundaries of coexistence in a space too small for secrets, but large enough for careful distance. Grace checked Nathaniel's wound each morning, unwrapping the bandages with hands that no longer trembled, examining the neat line of fishing line stitches for signs of infection. The flesh remained pink and healthy, healing with the stubborn efficiency of a strong body given proper care. By the fourth day, he could move without wincing. By the seventh, he insisted on splitting firewood while she watched from the cabin door, arms crossed, medical disapproval written plainly on her face. "You'll tear the stitches," she called as he raised the axe. "I'll freeze if we run out of wood," he called back and brought the blade down with perfect precision, cleaving the log along its grain. In return for her healing, Nathaniel fed her. It became an obsession Grace recognized but did not understand. He watched her eat with an intensity that made her self-conscious, ladling extra portions of stew into her bowl, cutting thick slabs of elk meat, and insisting she finish them. When she protested that she was full, he would simply look at her, at the way her collarbones stood out too sharply, at the thinness of her wrists, and say nothing. But the next meal would be even larger. "You're too thin," he said finally on the fifth night, as she pushed away from a supper she could not finish. "Wind'll blow you away come spring." "I've always been small," Grace replied, defensive. "Not small, starved." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, firelight catching the planes of his face. "You got that look, the look of a Joe that's been kicked away from the table too many times." Grace stiffened. "I chose to serve God. The vows included fasting sacrifice." "Sacrifice is giving up something you have. What you did was just dying slowly." He stood, took her bowl, ladled more stew into it without asking permission. Set it back in front of her. "Eat." The command should have angered her. Instead, something in his voice, some combination of concern and absolute authority, made her pick up the spoon. They developed routines. Grace woke first, rekindled the fire from banked coals. Nathaniel emerged from his bearskin nest looking rumpled and somehow larger in the morning light. They ate breakfast in companionable silence. She changed his bandages. He taught her skills he claimed she would need. On the sixth day, he taught her to shoot. The Colt 45 Peacemaker felt impossibly heavy in her small hands. Nathaniel stood behind her, his presence warm and solid, guiding her wrists into position. "It's a single-action revolver," he explained, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "You load 5 rounds, leave the 6th chamber empty under the hammer. Safety precaution. You cock the hammer with your thumb like this." His hand covered hers, showing her the motion. "Then you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Squeeze. Like you're pressing down on something fragile." Grace felt the weight of the weapon, the weight of his hands over hers, the weight of standing so close to a man that she could feel the heat of his body through the layers of fabric between them. "Breathe out slow," Nathaniel murmured. "Squeeze between heartbeats." She did. The gun roared. 20 yards away, a tin can exploded off its log perch. Grace gasped, surprised by her own success, turned her head to look at Nathaniel and found his face inches from hers, close enough to see flecks of darker blue in those glacial eyes, close enough to feel the smile that curved his bearded mouth. "Natural shooter," he said quietly. "Your hands are steady." The moment stretched. Grace became acutely aware of everywhere their bodies touched. His chest against her back, his arms bracketing hers, the smell of wood smoke and leather, and something uniquely him. She stepped away quickly, too quickly. Nathaniel let her go without comment, but something had shifted in the air between them, some acknowledgement of attraction that could not be unspoken once noticed. That evening, Nathaniel taught her to carve. "See the grain?" He held a piece of pine in one large hand, a knife in the other. Wood wants to split certain ways. You cut with the grain, never against it. The wood will tell you where it wants to go if you listen. He placed the knife in Grace's hand, then covered it with his own, guiding the blade along the wood's natural lines. She tried to focus on the lesson on the feel of the knife and the resistance of the wood, but all she could think about was the warmth of his palm, the casual intimacy of the gesture. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, still guiding her hands. "My grandfather. Before my father decided I should be a gentleman, grandfather taught me real skills, building, hunting, surviving." "Your father wanted you to be a gentleman." Another pause. Longer this time. Nathaniel released her hand, sat back, looked into the fire with eyes that saw past the flames to memories Grace could not touch. "My father wanted me to be many things," he said finally. "Most of them I wasn't. Some of them I tried to be and failed. And one of them got my brother killed." The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace set down the knife and wood, turned to face him fully. "Tell me," she said. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked beneath his beard. Then he stood, a decision made, and walked to where she sat. He reached out his hand, hovering near her face, then gently, with infinite care, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender it made Grace's chest ache. "You want to know the worst thing I've done?" Nathaniel asked, his voice rough. "You sure about that, sister?" "I'm sure." Nathaniel's hand dropped. He walked to the window, looked out at the endless white. When he spoke, his voice was flat, toneless. The voice of a man reciting facts he had lived with so long they had worn smooth. "I killed my brother." The confession landed in the quiet cabin like a stone in still water. Grace did not move, did not gasp, simply waited. "His name was Robert Blackwell," Nathaniel continued, still not looking at her. "Older than me by 2 years, heir to Blackwell Steel and Railway, my father's empire. We owned half the train tracks west of the Mississippi, owned factories in Pittsburgh, owned mines in Colorado, owned politicians in Washington." He turned then, and Grace saw something in his face she had not seen before. Shame, raw and unhealed even after years. Robert was charming to everyone who mattered. At dinner parties he quoted poetry. At business meetings he was brilliant. Father groomed him to take over the empire. But in our Boston mansion behind closed doors, Robert was a monster. Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides. He hurt people, servants mostly, young women, girls who had no power, no voice, no way to fight back. Father knew, paid them off, sent them away, called it youthful indiscretion, said boys would be ones, said power came with privileges. Grace felt sick. Your father protected him, enabled him, taught him that money buys silence, that powerful men don't face consequences. "And you," Grace asked quietly, "what did you do?" Nathaniel laughed, bitter and sharp. "Nothing. For years, I was the younger son, the spare. I didn't want the business, didn't want the power. I wanted to build things. I studied engineering. Thought I could design bridges, dams, things that mattered. But I knew what Robert was. Knew and did nothing because I was a coward who told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." He crossed back to Grace, dropped to one knee so their eyes were level. "Until the day I found him in the servants' quarters with a 14-year-old girl named Anne. She was crying, bleeding, and Robert was laughing." Grace's hands found each other, fingers interlacing, holding on. "I pulled him off her," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He swung at me, called me righteous, called me soft, said I didn't understand how the world worked. I swung back." His eyes met Grace's, and in them she saw not just shame, but something worse. The terrible certainty of a man who knew exactly what he had become in that moment. "I didn't stop," Nathaniel said. "Even after he went down, even after he stopped moving. I kept hitting, breaking, destroying. When I came back to myself, Robert was on the floor, skull fractured, not breathing. I'd beaten my own brother to death with my bare hands." The fire crackled. Outside wind moaned through the peaks. Grace did not pull away. "What happened to the girl?" she asked. "Anne." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Relief, perhaps, that she had asked. I gave her $5,000 from my inheritance, put her on a train to California with a new name. She was the only witness. She never testified, never spoke of what she saw. And your father, Maxwell Blackwell, didn't call the police. He called his lawyers. Tried to buy me a verdict, a sympathetic jury, a judge who would call it self-defense or temporary insanity. But I refused. Told him I'd hang before I let him cover it up. Told him I'd testify to everything. Robert's crimes, father's complicity, all of it. Nathaniel stood, began to pace. Father couldn't have that. Bad for business. Bad for the family name. So he made me a deal. I disappear. Completely. Change my name. Never contact the family again. Never claim my inheritance. Never return to Boston. In exchange, he tells the world Robert died in a hunting accident, and he puts a private bounty on my head. $25,000 to anyone who brings me back alive. Grace's mind raced. So you came here 5 years ago, bought this land under the name Nathaniel Cross, built this cabin with my own hands, and I've been hiding ever since. From bounty hunters, from my father's reach, from the man I was and the man I became. He turned back to her, and now his eyes burned with intensity. I ain't Nathaniel Cross, the mountain hermit, Grace. I'm Nathaniel Blackwell, heir to a railway fortune I don't want, wanted by my own father, hunted by anyone who knows my face and wants that bounty. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood over her, massive and powerful and somehow vulnerable all at once. And now you know my secret, he said quietly, which means I got a problem, because I can't let you leave Grace. You could expose me, turn me in. Collect that bounty yourself. Grace stood slowly, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear, from something else entirely, something she should not feel, something her vows forbade. I won't tell, she whispered. I know you won't. Nathaniel murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Because you're not leaving, not ever, not because I'll stop you, but because you don't want to. It was not a threat, it was a promise, and the terrible truth was that Grace realized, standing in the firelight, looking up at this man who was both killer and savior, that he was right. She did not want to leave. The days that followed moved differently, slower, heavier, charged with an awareness that made simple tasks feel dangerous. Nathaniel teaching Grace to identify animal tracks in snow, their shoulders touching as they bent over the marks. Grace reading aloud from Shakespeare, while Nathaniel whittled her voice, catching on certain passages, certain words about desire and fate, and choices that could not be unmade. On the 10th night, Grace found the sketchbook. It was lying on the table, half hidden under a cloth. She opened it without thinking and found herself staring at her own face. The drawing was in charcoal, detailed and careful, showing Grace asleep, her hair fanned across a pillow, her expression peaceful in a way she never felt while awake. The artistry was remarkable, each line precise, each shadow purposeful. Whoever had drawn this had spent hours studying her face. You drew me, Grace said. It was not a question. Nathaniel looked up from the wood he was carving, showed no embarrassment at being caught. You got a peaceful face when you ain't terrified. I'm not terrified anymore. You should be. Nathaniel set down his knife, stood. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. I'm a dangerous man, Grace. I've killed. I'll kill again if I need to. There's a reason I live up here alone. Grace closed the sketchbook carefully. Then tell me why. Tell me who you are when you're not being dangerous. I just told you, I'm Nathaniel Blackwell, killer, fugitive. No, Grace shook her head. That's what you did. That's not who you are. Who are you? Nathaniel stared at her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, almost to himself, I don't remember anymore. Grace crossed to him, reached up, placed her palm against his bearded cheek, felt him freeze under her touch. Then let me help you remember, she said. That night, Nathaniel had nightmares. Grace woke to his screaming, harsh guttural sounds that came from somewhere deep and primal. She threw off the furs, ran to where he thrashed on the floor, caught in some private hell. No, he shouted. Anne, get away from her. Robert, stop, stop. Grace knelt beside him, placed her hands on his shoulders. Nathaniel, wake up. You're safe. His eyes snapped open, wild, unfocused. His hand shot out, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. Then recognition flooded his face. His grip loosened. "Grace," he breathed. She was still kneeling beside him, still in her thin nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. The fire had burned low, casting them both in amber shadow. Nathaniel sat up slowly. Grace did not move away. Should have moved away. Should have returned to the bed, to safety, to the careful distance they had maintained. Instead, she stayed. "You dream about him," she said quietly. "About your brother. Every night. Have for 5 years." Nathaniel rubbed his face with both hands. "Every night I'm back in that room. Every night I kill him again. And every night I can't tell if I'm sorry or if I'd do it again." "Both," Grace said. "You can be both." He looked at her then, really looked. Took in her proximity, her state of undress, the way the firelight caught in her hair like captured flame. "You should go back to bed, sister," he said, his voice rough. Grace heard the warning in his words, heard the restraint, but she also heard something else. Want, need, the same thing she felt coiling in her own chest, dangerous and undeniable. "I don't feel like a sister anymore," she whispered. "Grace," her name was a plea. "If you don't leave now, I won't be able to keep my word." She should have stood, should have walked away, should have remembered her vows, her calling the promises she had made before God and witnesses. Instead, Grace leaned forward, placed her lips against his. Nathaniel went rigid, for one heartbeat, two. Then something broke in him. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with a desperation that matched her own. They made love on the bearskin rug by firelight while the blizzard raged outside. Grace gave herself to him, knowing it meant breaking every vow she had ever taken. Gave herself freely, completely discovering that her body knew languages her spirit had been forbidden to speak. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the furs Nathaniel pulled from the bed. Grace's head rested on his chest, rising and falling with his breath. His hand traced slow patterns on her bare shoulder. "I've never," Grace started, then stopped. Started again. "With anyone. Before tonight." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "I could tell. I've broken my vows. I've sinned against God. I've given myself to a man outside of marriage." Her voice cracked. "I've failed everyone. My father, my mother superior, myself." Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. "Grace, look at me." She tilted her head back, met those glacial eyes. "Your father was a doctor, right? A healer." She nodded. "Would he want you dead in that snow? Would he want you to choose vows over life?" "No," Grace whispered. "He'd want me alive." "Then you haven't failed him. You survived. You saved a stranger. You chose life even when it meant breaking promises." He kissed her forehead, gentle as prayer. "If that's failure, then we're all doomed." Grace closed her eyes, let his words wash over her, let herself believe for just this moment that love could be sacred even when it was forbidden. Outside, the wind began to change. Subtly at first, a shift in tone, a warming. The blizzard was breaking. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight, real sunlight, the first she had seen since arriving at the cabin. She went to the window, looked out at a world transformed. The snow had stopped. The peaks glittered white and gold. And far below in the valley, she could see the pass. It was still buried, but in places, darker patches showed where wind had blown the snow thin. In a week, maybe two, it would be passable. She could leave. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, fully dressed, beard still damp from washing. He followed her gaze to the pass. "Couple weeks," he said. "Maybe less if the weather holds." Grace turned to him. "And then I guide you to Montana like I promised. Help you disappear. You can start over where Crane can't reach." "Alone," Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That's up to you." Before Grace could respond, before she could ask what she wanted to ask, what she needed to know, a sound cut through the morning stillness. A gunshot, distant but unmistakable. From the valley below, then another, and another. Nathaniel's expression went cold and hard. He crossed to the gun rack, pulled down the Winchester rifle, began loading it with practiced efficiency. "What is it?" Grace asked, fear climbing her throat. "Company," Nathaniel said grimly, "the kind that shoots before talking. Get dressed, get your things, be ready to run." Another shot closer this time. Then voices faint but carrying in the thin mountain air. Nathaniel Cross, we know you're up there. Send out Sister Grace Hartley, or we burn you out. Grace's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice. Sheriff Marcus Webb, Crane's man. Crane's bought and paid for enforcer. Nathaniel looked at her, and in his eyes she saw calculation. Options being weighed, odds being measured. How many can you take? Grace asked. In a straight fight, maybe 5. But they won't fight straight. They'll surround the cabin, use the trees for cover, pick us off if we run, burn us if we stay. So what do we do? Nathaniel handed her the Colt 45, the one he had taught her to shoot. You hide. There's a root cellar under that rug. Trap door. It's stocked with supplies. Water. Dried food. If they breach the cabin, you go down there. You stay quiet. You wait until dark. Then you take the horse in the shed and you ride west. Montana. You don't look back. What about you? I'll hold them off as long as I can. No, Grace grabbed his arm. We fight together or we run together. I'm not hiding while you die for me. You're carrying more than yourself now, Nathaniel said quietly. Grace froze, stared at him. How did you know? You've been sick every morning for 3 days. You're eating like you're feeding too. I'm not blind, Grace, and I'm not letting them kill my child. The word hung between them. Child, their child. Life created in the midst of hiding and healing and desperate connection. Before Grace could respond, the window exploded inward. Glass and wood fragments sprayed across the cabin. Return fire from the valley. They were out of time. Nathaniel grabbed Grace, pushed her toward the bed. Under. Now. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Nathaniel, please. He kissed her, hard and fast and final. I love you, Grace Hartley, and I will see you free or die trying. Then he shoved her toward the trapdoor and turned to face the door. The siege began in earnest. Rifle fire punched through the cabin walls. Nathaniel returned fire with cold precision, each shot placed with the skill of a man who had been trained in more than engineering. Grace huddled in the crawl space beneath the cabin floor, her hands pressed over her ears, counting the shots, counting the seconds, praying to a God she was no longer sure was listening. 20 minutes of hell, 20 minutes of wood splintering and smoke and the smell of gunpowder and blood. She heard Nathaniel curse, heard him reload, heard screams from outside as his bullets found targets. Then she heard Sheriff Webb's voice, high and panicked. Burn it, torch the damn thing, smoke, thick and choking, seeping through the floorboards. The roof was on fire. Grace heard Nathaniel's roar of frustration, then his voice loud enough to carry through the gunfire. I'm coming out! Don't shoot! I'm coming out! No, Grace screamed, scrambling from under the bed. Nathaniel, no! He turned to her and his face was etched with agony. If we stay, you burn. If I fight, you catch a stray bullet. This is the only way. He threw his rifle down, raised his hands, kicked the door open, walked out into the snow with his massive frame silhouetted against the burning cabin behind him. Grace ran to the doorway, coughing from smoke. Saw Sheriff Webb and 9 other men, rifles trained on Nathaniel. Saw Nathaniel drop to his knees, hands still raised. 2 deputies rushed forward, grabbed Grace's arms. Their grips were bruising impersonal. Nathaniel lunged. A primal roar tore from his throat. He managed 2 steps before a rifle butt caught him in the stomach. He doubled over. Another blow to the jaw. Blood and teeth sprayed onto white snow. He went down on one knee, still fighting to rise. Don't touch her, he snarled through broken teeth. You don't get to touch her. Sheriff Webb walked up to Nathaniel, placed the barrel of his pistol against the giant's forehead. The contempt in his voice was absolute. You're under arrest for harboring a fugitive cross, for resisting arrest, for attempted murder of peace officers. He cocked the hammer. Tie him to a horse. Drag him if you have to. We're taking them both back to Cheyenne, to hang. Grace screamed Nathaniel's name as they bound her wrists, but the last thing she saw as they dragged her down the mountain was Nathaniel beaten and bloody, staring at her with eyes that held no defeat, only a promise of retribution. They were separated immediately upon arrival in Cheyenne. Grace was thrown into a cell on the 2nd floor of the Laramie County Jail, a room that smelled of urine and despair. Nathaniel, she learned from the guard's casual conversation, had been taken to the basement dungeon, the place reserved for the violently insane. 3 days passed. 3 days of cold and fear and morning sickness that left her retching into a bucket until there was nothing left to bring up. On the fourth day, Judge Howard Crane came to visit. He looked impeccable. Tailored suit that cost more than Grace would have earned in 10 lifetimes. White hair perfectly groomed, a handkerchief held delicately to his nose as if the smell of the jail offended his refined sensibilities. "Miss Hartley," Crane said smoothly, stopping just outside her cell bars, "you've caused me considerable trouble." Grace stood, walked to the bars, met his eyes with all the defiance she could summon. "You murdered Margaret Brooks. I saw you. I'll testify." Crane chuckled. The sound was oily practiced. "Margaret, a tragic case. Unstable girl. Hysterical. Just like you, I'm afraid. Who will a jury believe, Miss Hartley, a Supreme Court judge with an impeccable record, or a drug-addicted former nun who fled the scene of a crime? I'm not addicted to anything. Morphine was found in your possession when you were arrested, stolen from the convent. The Mother Superior has already testified to your erratic behavior in the days before you fled." Crane smiled. "I've come to offer you a deal. Sign a confession, admit you stole the morphine, admit you imagined the attack due to your addiction and religious mania. I'll see you committed to an asylum instead of the gallows." "And Nathaniel," Crane's smile vanished, "the savage who attacked officers of the law, he hangs Friday regardless of what you sign. Some fates are sealed." Grace walked to the bars, looked Crane directly in his cold, dead eyes, and spat in his face. Crane wiped his cheeks slowly, methodically. When he looked at Grace again, his expression had shifted from smugness to pure malice. "Have it your way," he said quietly. "Friday at noon. You can watch him drop before your turn comes. Enjoy your last days, sister. I'll make sure they're memorable." Meanwhile, in the basement dungeon, Nathaniel Blackwell sat chained to a wall planning. Deputy Samuel Brooks was on guard duty. The young man sat reading a newspaper, eating an apple, occasionally glancing at his prisoner with a mixture of pity and professional distance. "Hey," Nathaniel rasped. His voice was rough from disuse and the beating he had taken. "Brooks, shut up, Cross. That newspaper, check the financial section. Look for anything about the Blackwell Railway expansion." Brooks snorted. "Why you planning to invest from the gallows?" "Just look." Something in Nathaniel's voice made the deputy pause, made him flip to the back pages, made him scan the columns until his fingers stopped on a small notice. Brooks read aloud, voice uncertain. "Blackwell heir missing, presumed dead. Family offers $10,000 reward for information leading to his safe return." He looked up at Nathaniel, at the dirty, beaten man chained to the dungeon wall, back down at the newspaper. "You're lying," Brooks whispered. "Left boot," Nathaniel said calmly. "Hollow heel. There's a signet ring inside, pure gold. Blackwell family crest. A roaring lion. Check it." Brooks hesitated. Then, moving slowly as if approaching a dangerous animal, he crossed to Nathaniel, pulled off the left boot, felt along the heel until his fingers found the hidden compartment, pried it open. A heavy gold ring tumbled into his palm. Even in the dim dungeon light it gleamed. The engraving was clear, unmistakable. The Blackwell lion rampant, surrounded by railway wheels, and the family motto, "Fortis Fortuna Adiuvat." Fortune favors the bold. Brooks stared at the ring, at Nathaniel. His hands shook. "Holy God," he breathed. "You're really him." "I really am," Nathaniel confirmed. "Now we can do this two ways, Deputy. You can collect that $10,000 reward, turn me over to my family, become a moderately wealthy man. Or you can help me. And instead of 10,000, you get 50,000, plus a position as head of security for all Blackwell Western operations, plus the satisfaction of watching Judge Howard Crane fall." Brooks sank onto his stool. "Why would I risk my career, my life?" Nathaniel leaned forward as far as his chains allowed. "Because 3 years ago, Margaret Brooks was your sister. Because Crane killed her and got away with that. Because you've been waiting for justice and it never came. Until now." The name hit Brooks like a physical blow. His face crumpled. "How do you know about Margaret?" "Sister Grace told me. About the convent. About finding Crane strangling your sister. About you giving Grace the ledger to hide." Nathaniel's voice softened. I know what it's like to lose someone to a powerful man's cruelty. I killed my own brother for the same. You want justice for Margaret? Brooks's eyes filled with tears. More than anything. Then get a telegram to Denver. To the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Tell them Nathaniel Blackwell is alive and in custody. Tell them to bring the armored train. Tell them to bring Arthur Sterling, my family's lawyer. Tell them the trial is Friday. They have 3 days. And if they don't make it in time, then you take this ring to my father after I'm dead and collect your 10,000. But if they do make it, Nathaniel smiled cold and sharp, then we burn Crane's world down together. For Margaret, for Grace, for everyone he's destroyed. Brooks looked at the ring in his palm, at the newspaper article, at the man who was supposed to be a mountain hermit, but was actually heir to a fortune that could buy and sell Wyoming territory 10 times over. He made his choice. For Margaret, Brooks said quietly, what else do you need? File the handcuffs, not all the way, just enough that I can break them when the time comes, and bring me a stake. I'm going to need my strength. Brooks nodded, started to leave. Turned back. The nun, Sister Grace, is she really pregnant? Nathaniel's expression shifted, became something fierce and protective. She is, with my child, which is why Crane dies if he touches her, and why I need you to make sure that telegram gets sent. Tonight. Brooks held Nathaniel's gaze for a long moment. Then he pocketed the ring and newspaper. Consider it done. After Brooks left and Nathaniel leaned back against the cold stone wall, closed his eyes, let himself think of Grace, of the child growing inside her, of the life they might have if he could pull off what he was planning. In her cell 2 floors above, Grace knelt on the cold stone floor and prayed to a God she was no longer sure existed. Hail Mary, Mother of God, I have sinned. I have broken my vows. I lie with a man. I carry his child. But I don't ask forgiveness for loving him. I ask only this, let me see him one last time. Let me tell him about the child. Let him die knowing he created life, not just took it. At midnight, her prayer was answered. Brooks appeared at her cell door, unlocked it, put a finger to his lips. 5 minutes, he whispered. That's all I can give you. He led her down dark corridors through passages she did not know existed to the dungeon where Nathaniel waited. When Grace saw him, she broke free of Brooks and ran, fell to her knees beside him. Her hands found his face, his beard, the bruises and cuts that mapped his suffering. Nathaniel, she breathed. Grace. His voice was rough, but his eyes were clear, focused. I thought I'd never see you again. They're going to hang us both, Grace said, tears streaming. Friday. Crane arranged it all. I know. Nathaniel leaned his head against hers as much as the chains allowed. But listen to me. I'm getting you out. I have a plan. Brooks is helping. The Pinkertons are coming. My father's lawyers. We're going to expose Crane. We're going to be free. How you're chained. I'm locked up. He owns everything. Not everything. He doesn't own the truth, and he doesn't own what we've become. Nathaniel pulled back enough to look into her eyes. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Grace nodded. And I need you to tell me something. Brooks said he thought you were pregnant. Is it true? Grace's hand moved to her stomach. I think so. It's too early to be certain, but I feel different. And I've been sick every morning. Nathaniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, they blazed with an intensity that took Grace's breath. Then you listen to me, Grace Hartley. Whatever happens Friday, you live. For that child. For our child. You understand you live. Only if you live too. I will burn this whole town down before I let Crane hang you. Both of you. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I love you. I should have said it sooner. I love you more than fortune, more than freedom, more than my own life. I love you, Grace whispered back. I love you and I'm not sorry. Not for any of it. Brooks appeared in the doorway. Time's up, sorry. Grace clutched Nathaniel's hand until Brooks gently pulled her away. The last thing she saw before the dungeon door closed was Nathaniel chained but unbroken, watching her with eyes that promised revolution. Back in her cell, Grace lay on the cold stone and placed both hands over her belly. Your father is coming for us, she whispered to the tiny life growing inside her. He's going to save us both. You just wait and see. Outside in the streets of Cheyenne, an armored train was making its way through the darkness. Inside were 4 Pinkerton agents, Arthur Sterling, Esquire, and enough legal documentation to bring down a judge. The reckoning was 3 days away. The Laramie County Courthouse smelled of unwashed wool and stale tobacco smoke, and something else, something Grace recognized from her years tending the sick. The smell of anticipation, of people gathered to witness death. December 7th, 1888, 9 o'clock in the morning. Execution day. Grace sat in the defendant's dock, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She wore the same gray dress she had been arrested in, now stained with 3 days of jail grime, but she held her chin high. If she was going to die today, she would not give Judge Howard Crane the satisfaction of seeing her break. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. 200 people or more, men standing shoulder to shoulder along the back walls, women fanning themselves despite the December cold, whispering behind gloved hands. They had come for a show. A double hanging was better entertainment than the theater, more visceral than any play, the kind of spectacle that people would talk about for years. Judge Crane entered through the door behind the bench, and the room fell silent. He wore his black robes like armor, his white hair perfectly combed, his expression serene. He looked impeccable, untouchable, the very picture of judicial authority. Grace met his eyes across the crowded room and saw nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just cold bureaucratic indifference. She was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied, nothing more. "Bring in the co-conspirator," Crane commanded, his voice carrying easily through the hushed space. The side door opened. The murmur in the room shifted to something darker, more hostile. 3 deputies dragged Nathaniel Blackwell into the courtroom. They had chained him heavily, manacles on his wrists, shackles on his ankles, a heavy chain connecting his waist to bolts in the floor. He had clearly been beaten again in his cell. His left eye was swollen, completely shut. A fresh cut ran through his beard, matting the dark hair with blood, but he did not look defeated. As he limped into the room, towering over the deputies, even in chains, the crowd fell silent. He possessed a raw physical danger that iron could not contain. He scanned the room methodically, his one good eye sweeping over the jeering townspeople until it landed on Grace. His expression softened for a fraction of a second. He gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. "Hold on." "Nathaniel Cross," Judge Crane boomed clearly, enjoying the sound of his own voice echoing through the courthouse. "You stand before this court convicted of the attempted murder of Sheriff Marcus Webb, the kidnapping of Sister Grace Hartley, and resisting lawful arrest. Given your violent nature and complete lack of remorse, the penalty for these crimes is death by hanging." He turned his attention to Grace, and she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "And you, Grace Hartley, convicted of grand larceny, slander against a court official, and aiding a known fugitive. Your sentence shall be the same." Grace felt the breath leave her lungs. She had expected prison, hard labor, even exile. But death, Crane was eliminating every witness, every threat, making sure no one could ever contradict his version of events. "Have the prisoners anything to say before I pass final judgment?" Crane asked, reaching for his quill to sign the death warrants. He did not actually expect an answer. It was pure formality, theater for the crowd. "I do." The voice was deep and resonant and startlingly calm. Not the grunt of a mountain man, the measured baritone of a boardroom, of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Nathaniel took a step forward. The chains rattled ominously. Sheriff Webb barked from the side of the room, his hand dropping to his holster. "Sit down, savage." Nathaniel ignored him. His attention remained fixed on Crane. "I'd like to call a witness to the stand." The jury box erupted in laughter. 12 men handpicked by Webb, mostly saloon regulars and cattle hands on Crane's payroll. They found the idea of this chained mountain man demanding legal procedure hilarious. Crane scoffed, dropping his quill. "This is a sentencing hearing, Mr. Cross, not a trial. You had your chance to speak. Now you will listen to the rope tighten. Sheriff, remove him from my courtroom." Webb moved forward, reaching for Nathaniel's chains. "I object." The words rang out from the back of the courtroom, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the noise like a knife through silk. Every head in the room turned. The double doors at the rear of the courthouse swung open with dramatic force, hinges protesting. Standing in the threshold, framed perfectly by the bright winter light from the street beyond, was a man who clearly did not belong in Wyoming territory. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit tailored in London, the kind that cost more than most men in the room earned in 5 years. A silk cravat at his throat, oxblood leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He carried a calfskin briefcase in one hand, his posture radiating confidence and expensive education. But it was the men behind him that made Sheriff Webb freeze mid-step. 4 men flanked the stranger. They wore long duster coats, bowler hats, and expressions of professional menace. On their chests catching the light gleamed the distinctive 7-pointed star badges of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. In their hands, held at low ready, with the casual competence of men who knew how to use them, were Winchester Model 1877 lever-action shotguns. "Who the devil are you?" Crane demanded, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "This is a closed session. You have no authority here." The man in the pinstripe suit walked down the center aisle with measured steps. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea before Moses' people, scrambling to get out of the way of the Pinkertons and their shotguns. "My name," the man announced, his voice projecting with the practiced ease of a courtroom veteran, "is Arthur Sterling, Esquire. I am the chief legal counsel for Blackwell Steel and Railway Trust, based in Boston and New York City." He reached the defendant's table, set his briefcase down with deliberate care, turned to face the bench. "I am here to represent my client, Mr. Nathaniel Blackwell, currently known to this court as Nathaniel Cross." The gasp that swept through the courtroom was visceral. It started in the front row and rolled backward like a physical wave. Women clutched their fans, men leaned forward in their seats. The name Blackwell carried weight even in this remote territory. It was a name built of steel and steam and the blood of workers who had laid tracks across the continent. A name that represented power and wealth on a scale most people could not comprehend. Grace stared at Nathaniel. She had known his secret had held it close for weeks, but seeing it weaponized in open court, seeing the reaction it provoked, drove home just how enormous the stakes truly were. The dirty, bloodied mountain man standing in chains was heir to one of the largest fortunes in America. Sheriff Webb found his voice first. "That's impossible, Lies. That man is a hermit. He lives in a shack. He's a nobody." Sterling turned to Webb with the kind of pitying look a professor might give a particularly slow student. "Is he Mr. Blackwell, if you would be so kind as to demonstrate?" Nathaniel looked down at the handcuffs binding his wrists. Heavy iron, double-locked. Supposed to be escape-proof. Supposed to be. Deputy Brooks had filed the internal mechanisms 2 nights ago, careful work done in secret. Left just enough metal that the cuffs would hold under normal stress, but would snap if force was applied in exactly the right way. Nathaniel twisted his wrists, applied pressure at the precise angle Brooks had shown him. The handcuffs snapped open with a sharp metallic click and fell to the floor. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Women screamed, men shouted. Sheriff Webb drew down his pistol, raising it toward Nathaniel. 4 shotguns racked simultaneously. The sound was louder than any gunshot, a mechanical thunder that froze everyone in place. The Pinkertons had not fired, but their weapons were now leveled directly at Webb and his deputies. The message was clear. Move and die. "Drop it, Marcus," Nathaniel said quietly. His voice did not rise, but it filled the room anyway, carrying absolute authority. Not the voice of a prisoner, but of a man who owned the ground beneath everyone's feet. Webb looked at the Pinkertons, looked at their shotguns, looked at Nathaniel now, free of the handcuffs, standing to his full imposing height. Slowly, Webb lowered his Colt, placed it on the floor with shaking hands. Nathaniel stepped out of the ankle shackles. Brooks had done his work well there too, rubbed his wrists where the iron had chafed. Then he walked toward the bench, each step deliberate, and Grace saw him transform before her eyes. No longer the wounded fugitive, no longer the mountain hermit. He moved like what he truly was. Old money, Eastern power, a man born to command empires. "This is preposterous," Crane stammered, looking around for support that was not coming. Even his hand-picked jury was leaning away, suddenly uncertain. "I will have you all arrested. I am the law in this territory." "Not anymore," Sterling interrupted smoothly. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a sheaf of documents bound with red ribbon. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, the Blackwell Trust has purchased the entirety of the Laramie County municipal bonds. We have also acquired the mortgage on this courthouse, the county jail, and I'm pleased to inform you your personal estate as well, Your Honor." Sterling slammed the papers onto the bench with enough force to make Crane flinch. Technically speaking, Judge Crane, my client is now your landlord, and he is evicting you. Crane sank back into his chair. His face had gone the color of old parchment white and brittle looking. You cannot. You have no right. But that's not why I'm here, Nathaniel said, his voice cutting across Crane's protests. He stopped at the railing, just feet from the bench, and reached into the inside pocket of his ragged jacket. Grace's breath caught. She watched him pull out a small black leather-bound ledger. She recognized it immediately. The ledger Samuel Brooks had pressed into her hands the night Margaret died. The ledger she had carried through the blizzard. The ledger that held Crane's secrets. This, Nathaniel announced, holding it up so the entire courtroom could see, is Judge Howard Crane's personal ledger. The room fell silent. Not the restless silence of before, but something deeper. The silence of people holding their collective breath. It details payments from the Denver mining syndicate. Nathaniel continued, his voice clear and measured. Bribes accepted from cattle barons in exchange for favorable rulings on land disputes. Hush money paid to women. Payments to Sheriff Webb for services rendered. He opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of cloth. Grace realized with a jolt that it was a piece of her old habit torn and used as a bookmark. November 9th, 1888, Nathaniel read aloud. Payment to Sheriff Marcus Webb, $50. Item disposal of the girl Margaret. Problem resolved. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. The truth laid bare and irrefutable. Crane's carefully constructed facade shattered. Grace watched it happen in real time. The confident judge became a cornered animal, eyes darting looking for escape routes that did not exist. He's lying, Crane shrieked, his voice cracking into a register that betrayed panic. That's a forgery. Arrest him, all of them. I order you. No one moved. The jury stared at Crane. The townspeople stared at Crane. Even Webb and his deputies were backing away, distancing themselves from a man who had suddenly become toxic. From the back of the courtroom, Deputy Samuel Brooks stepped forward. His young face was pale but determined. He walked down the aisle until he stood before the bench. It's not a forgery, Your Honor, Brooks said, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. I was there the night you killed my sister Margaret. I watched Sister Grace try to save her. And I gave Grace that ledger when it fell from your coat after she struck you. Crane turned to stare at Brooks. Recognition and horror bloomed on his face. Margaret Brooks was 19 years old. Samuel continued, tears streaming openly down his face now. She was carrying your child. You promised to help her. Instead, you strangled her to keep her quiet. I've waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years of watching you walk free while my sister lies in an unmarked grave. He turned to address the courtroom, his voice rising. This man is not a judge. He's a murderer who bought a title and used it to destroy anyone who threatened to expose him. The crowd erupted, not in support of Crane, but in outrage. Voices rose in anger. People stood. The careful order of the courtroom dissolved into chaos. And in that case, Crane made his final desperate move. His hand disappeared under his judicial robes. Grace saw the motion. Recognized it. He has a gun, she screamed. Time slowed to a crawl. Crane pulled a small, pearl-handled derringer from a hidden pocket. A gentleman's weapon. 2 shots. Not enough to fight his way out, but enough for revenge. He did not aim at Nathaniel, did not aim at Sterling or the Pinkertons. His hand came up trembling, but determined, and pointed the tiny pistol directly at Grace. The woman who had started all of this. The witness who had dared to strike him. The one person who could corroborate Brooks's testimony. If Crane was going down, he would take her with him. Grace stared down the barrel, saw Crane's finger tighten on the trigger, felt time freeze. Then something massive slammed between them. Nathaniel moved with impossible speed for a man his size, vaulted over the prosecution table, threw his entire body in front of Grace just as Crane fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Smoke and fire erupted from the derringer's barrel. The bullet meant for Grace's heart buried itself deep in Nathaniel's left shoulder. Instead, he grunted, a wet, heavy sound, staggered but did not fall. For one frozen heartbeat, the entire courtroom held its breath. Then the beast woke up. Nathaniel roared. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of mountains breaking, of avalanches beginning, of primal fury given voice. Blood bloomed across his shoulder, dark and spreading, but he did not stop. He crashed into the bench like a battering ram, grabbed Crane by the lapels of his expensive robes with one hand, hauled him over the desk as if he weighed nothing, slammed him onto the courtroom floor with enough force to crack the wooden boards. Crane screamed, tried to shield his face with his arms, tried to curl into a protective ball. Nathaniel raised his fist, a sledgehammer fist, scarred and bloodied, capable of crushing bone to powder. The rage in his glacial eyes was terrifying, absolute. He was going to kill Crane right there on the courtroom floor in front of 200 witnesses. The Pinkertons lowered their weapons, unsure whether to intervene. The crowd gasped, but no one moved to stop him. Even Sterling stood frozen, watching his client teeter on the edge of murder. Nathaniel, Grace's voice cut through the red haze like a blade of ice. She stood at the defendant's dock, both hands gripping the rail, tears streaming down her face. Nathaniel, stop! Look at me! His fist hovered inches from Crane's terrified, whimpering face. His chest heaved. Blood dripped from his shoulder onto Crane's white shirt, staining it red as a baptism. He turned his head slowly to look at Grace. Don't kill him, Grace said, and though her voice shook, the words were clear. You're not a murderer, Nathaniel. You killed your brother to save an innocent girl. That was justice. This, she gestured to Crane, cowering and pathetic beneath him. This is just revenge, and it will make you into exactly what he is. Don't let him turn you into a monster. Nathaniel stared at her. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by pain and exhaustion, and something that might have been relief. He looked down at Crane, at the judge who had destroyed so many lives, who had killed with impunity, who even now would face no real justice unless Nathaniel let him live to be prosecuted. Slowly, with visible effort, Nathaniel unclenched his fist. He stood, winced as his shoulder throbbed, reached down and grabbed Crane by the back of his collar, dragged him across the floor toward where Arthur Sterling stood. Take this trash out of my sight, Nathaniel growled, shoving Crane toward his lawyer. And make sure the territorial governor gets that ledger. Every page, every name. Let them all fall. Sterling nodded, professional composure cracking into something like pride. With pleasure, sir. Two Pinkertons grabbed the sobbing judge and hauled him toward the door. Crane's carefully constructed world had collapsed in less than 30 minutes. By nightfall, every newspaper in the territory would carry the story. By next week, the scandal would reach Washington. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was finished. Nathaniel turned back toward Grace, swayed slightly. The adrenaline was fading. Blood loss was catching up. Grace did not wait for permission. She kicked open the gate of the prisoner's dock and ran. Caught Nathaniel just as his knees began to buckle. You idiot, she sobbed, pressing her hands against his shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding. Her medical training kicked in automatically, assessing the wound, calculating blood loss. You giant, stubborn, magnificent idiot. Nathaniel looked down at her. His face was pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But he was smiling, a genuine crooked smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. I told you, he rasped, leaning his weight against her. Don't let people hurt you. Not anymore. Let's get you a doctor, Grace said, her voice fierce with love and worry. No. Nathaniel looked around the courtroom. Webb was cowering in a corner, his authority dissolved. The jury sat stunned and silent. The townspeople stared at them with something between awe and fear. Get me a carriage, we're going home. Home, Grace asked. To Boston. Nathaniel looked toward the courthouse doors, where snow had begun to fall again on the streets of Cheyenne. Fat, lazy flakes drifting down like blessings. No, he said softly. To the mountain. Let's go home, Grace. As they walked out of the courthouse together, the limping Mountain King and the woman who had healed him, not a single person dared to stand in their way. The legend of Nathaniel Cross had ended. The reign of the Blackwells had begun. The years that followed were not easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Nathaniel's shoulder healed, but never quite right. The bullet had shattered bone-damaged nerves. Cold weather brought pain. Heavy lifting brought weakness. He learned to use a cane hickory wood polished smooth by his own hands, and he learned that strength came in forms other than physical power. They did not return to Boston. When Maxwell Blackwell sent emissaries begging his son to come home, to take his rightful place at the head of the empire, Nathaniel sent them back with a simple message. The mountain was his empire now, the only kingdom he wanted. They rebuilt the cabin into something larger. Not a mansion. Nathaniel had no use for ostentation, but a proper home. 2 stories of hand-hewn timber and riverstone, windows that caught the sun, rooms enough for a family. Thomas was born in May of 1889. Grace labored for 18 hours while a blizzard raged outside, spring in the mountains being as unpredictable as winter. Nathaniel held her hand through it all. This man who had killed with those same hands, now gentle as prayer. When the baby finally came, tiny and red-faced and screaming with the outrage of being born, Nathaniel wept. Grace had never seen him cry, had wondered if he could. But he held his son, and tears ran into his beard, and he whispered, "He's perfect. You're both perfect." They married in a small ceremony performed by a traveling Methodist circuit rider who came through the valley twice a year. Grace wore a simple blue dress. Nathaniel wore his best buckskins cleaned and mended. There were no guests, no family, just the 3 of them and the minister in the mountains bearing witness. "Do you, Nathaniel, take Grace to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Grace, take Nathaniel to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Grace looked at the man beside her, the killer who had become a father, the fugitive who had become a builder, the heir who had chosen poverty over wealth and found richness anyway. "I do." They built a life together in the shadow of the peaks. Nathaniel taught Thomas to track deer, to split wood, to read the weather in the clouds. Grace taught him letters and numbers and the basics of medicine, just as her father had taught her. In 1893, Judge Howard Crane died in prison. Pneumonia, the warden's report said. He died alone in a cell not unlike the one where Grace had been held, unable to breathe, his power stripped away, forgotten by everyone except the people he had destroyed. Grace read the telegram informing them of his death and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet closing of a chapter that should have ended years ago. The Blackwell fortune continued to grow in the East, managed by trustees and lawyers. Nathaniel received quarterly reports that he mostly ignored, but he established the Blackwell Foundation, funded with money from his inheritance, dedicated to providing medical care and education to rural communities across Wyoming and Montana. Grace helped design the programs, drawing on her years as a healer. Deputy Samuel Brooks took the position as head of security for Blackwell Western Operations. He married, had children, named his eldest daughter Margaret after the sister he had lost. He visited the mountain once a year, always in summer, always bringing news of the wider world that Nathaniel and Grace had left behind. They grew older. Grace's hair turned silver at the temples. Nathaniel's beard went white. Thomas grew tall and strong, a perfect blend of his mother's kindness and his father's quiet strength. At 16, he went east for schooling, returned at 20 with an engineering degree and a wife named Sarah, and together they expanded the Blackwell holdings, not through conquest, but through innovation. Better rail systems, safer working conditions, fair wages. By 1920, Thomas and Sarah had given Nathaniel and Grace 5 grandchildren. The youngest was still in diapers. The eldest, William, was 16 and full of questions, which brought Nathaniel full circle to this November evening, sitting in his leather chair, telling his grandson the story of how a mountain hermit became a king. "And that's how I met your grandmother," Nathaniel said, his voice rough from talking. "That's how we came to be here." William sat silent on the bearskin rug, processing everything he had heard. Outside, full dark had fallen. Snow still fell heavier, now the first real storm of the season. "Grandfather," William said finally, "that telegram you got last week, the one from Boston about your father dying. You could go back now. The board wants you. You could run the whole company, be one of the richest men in America." Nathaniel reached into the drawer of his side table, pulled out the telegram William referenced, read it aloud. "Nathaniel, stop. Father deceased. Stop. You are now sole heir. Stop. Board requests your immediate return. Stop. Company needs leadership. Stop." He looked at his grandson. "You think I should go?" William hesitated. I think you could do a lot of good with that kind of power." Nathaniel smiled, set the telegram on the table, struck a match, held the flame to the corner of the paper, watched it catch and burn. I did go back once, Nathaniel said as the telegram curled into ash. In 1895, when the board couldn't decide on a new chairman, I stayed 3 weeks, wore suits that cost more than most men earn in a year, sat in meetings that accomplished nothing, slept in a mansion with 20 rooms, and felt more alone than I ever did in that one-room cabin. He let the last of the telegram fall into the fireplace. Your grandmother came with me. She lasted 5 days before she said if we didn't leave, she was going to walk back to Wyoming. So we left. And I realized something important. Money doesn't buy happiness. Power doesn't bring peace. And no amount of wealth can replace waking up next to the person you love in a place that feels like home. But you could help so many people, William protested. I do help. Through the foundation, through the business practices Thomas implements, through the example we set. Nathaniel leaned forward, caught his grandson's eyes. William, I've lived 2 lives. One in Boston, rich and powerful and miserable. One here simple and hard and full of meaning. I know which one I'd choose again. Every single time. The door opened. Grace entered, moving with the careful grace of a woman whose joints ached in the cold, but whose spirit remained undiminished. At 59, she was still beautiful, still sharp, still the woman who had saved a dying stranger in the snow. Telling war stories again, old man? She asked, warmth in her voice. Telling truth stories, Nathaniel replied. Grace walked over, bent down, kissed the top of his head with casual affection born of 3 decades together. Thomas and Sarah just arrived with the children. Dinner in 30 minutes. Through the window, William could see his father unloading a wagon, his mother carrying the baby, his younger siblings chasing each other through the snow, their laughter carrying on the wind. Grandfather, William said suddenly, you said you killed your brother. Don't you have regrets? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Grace's hand found his shoulder, a touch that spoke of shared history and mutual understanding. I regret the violence, Nathaniel said carefully. I regret that I couldn't save Robert before he became what he was. I regret that Anne had to suffer before I acted. But do I regret choosing justice over family loyalty? Do I regret standing up to my father? Do I regret running to this mountain and finding your grandmother? He looked up at Grace. She looked down at him. Something passed between them that needed no words. Not for 1 second, Nathaniel said. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. I chose grace over fortune, chose integrity over inheritance, and I never regretted it once. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the gold signet ring, the one he had hidden in his boot heel 32 years ago, held it out to William. This is yours now, the Blackwell crest, the family legacy, but I want you to understand something. Real legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you leave behind. Not money, not land, not titles or power. Values, integrity, love, that's what endures. William took the ring with trembling hands, turned it in the firelight, watching the engraved lion catch the glow. I'll remember, grandfather, he promised. See that you do. Nathaniel stood with the help of his cane, gestured for William to follow. Led him outside to where snow fell thick and soft, pointed up at the stone lintel above the main door. Carved there deep enough to last centuries were words and a date. Here lived the wolf and the dove. They feared no winter. NB and GH, 1888 to 1920. 32 years, Nathaniel said quietly. Best years of my life. Your grandmother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love despite fear. Choosing principle despite consequence. Choosing what's right even when it costs you everything. Grace's voice called from inside. Nathaniel Thomas wants to ask about expanding the West Barn. Says he needs the master builder's advice. Nathaniel chuckled, turned to William. Master builder, that's what she calls me when she wants something fixed. Come on, let's teach your father how to build properly. Some skills need passing down. William followed his grandfather inside, where 3 generations gathered around a table built by Nathaniel's own hands, where food was shared and stories were told, and the legacy of 2 people who chose love over everything else lived on in the faces of children and grandchildren. Outside, the snow fell heavier. The wind sang through the peaks. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent and beautiful. And somewhere in that white wilderness, if you knew where to look, you could still find the ruins of a one-room cabin. the place where a dying man met a starving woman, where violence became healing, where two fugitives found something more valuable than any fortune. They found each other. The wind carried the story across the years, would carry it further still, into a future where William would build hospitals in his grandparents' names, where his children would continue the foundation's work, where the legend of the Mountain King and the Healing Dove would pass into the folklore of the West, growing with each retelling until fact and myth blurred into something larger than either. But the truth remained carved in stone above a door that still welcomed family home. They feared no winner, because they had each other, and that was enough. Workers discovered the foundation in 1924 during an expansion of the Blackwell Lodge. They were digging for a new wing when they struck stone, the original cabin's granite base buried under 3 decades of growth and change. They found the iron box beneath what had been the floorboards. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Grace's journal. The pages were yellowed but intact. Her neat handwriting filled every page, a chronicle of survival and love, and choices made in desperation that led to Grace. The last entry was dated November 1920. Nathaniel told William our story today. I watched 3 generations together. Grandfather teaching, father teaching on. The cycle continues. This is what we built. Not an empire, a family, not wealth, a home, not power, love. If anyone finds this years from now, know this: we were not heroes. We were simply 2 people who chose each other when the world said we shouldn't, who chose truth when lies would have been easier, who chose a mountain over a mansion and found that we had chosen everything that mattered. The snow is falling. Nathaniel is calling me to dinner. Our grandchildren are laughing. This is what heaven sounds like. This is what we fought for. This is enough. The worker who found the journal was a young man, 23, new to the crew. He read the final page and felt something shift in his chest, some recognition of truth spoken across time. He showed it to his supervisor, who showed it to the foreman who contacted the Blackwell family. William Blackwell himself came to the site. He was 75 now, silver-haired and distinguished, a man who had built railways and hospitals and schools across 3 states. He held his grandmother's journal with hands that shook slightly, not from age but from emotion. My grandfather gave me this ring when I was 16, William said to the assembled workers, holding up his left hand where the gold signet gleamed. Told me that real legacy isn't what you inherit but what you pass down. Your grandmother wrote in this journal that they built a family, not an empire. She was wrong about one thing. He looked at the men and women gathered around him. Working people, honest labor, the kind of people his grandparents had always valued most. They built both, an empire of family, of values, of choices made right even when they cost everything. He gestured to the foundation stones. When you rebuild, keep this stone. Incorporate it into the new structure. Let it remain as witness. The workers nodded. They did exactly that. The new wing of the Blackwell Lodge rose around the old foundation. Modern construction, embracing ancient stone past and present, joined in architecture as they were joined in blood. And above the main entrance, they carved new words below the old inscription. Here lived the wolf and the dove. They feared no winter. Their legacy endures. Nathaniel Blackwell died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1925. He was 69 years old. His last words, whispered to Grace as dawn broke over the mountains they both loved, were simple. Thank you for saving me. Grace Blackwell lived another 36 years. She died in 1961 at the age of 94, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, too numerous to count. In her final days, when her mind wandered between present and past, she would sometimes wake and ask for Nathaniel. The nurses would gently remind her that he had been gone for decades. She would smile, pat their hands, say, I know, but he's waiting for me, on the mountain, in the snow, like always. She was buried beside him on a ridge overlooking the valley. Their graves face east toward the sunrise, toward the future they helped build. The Blackwell Foundation continues its work to this day, provides medical care to remote communities, funds education programs, supports victims of violence and abuse, helps people who have nowhere else to turn. Above the foundation's headquarters hangs a portrait, not of Nathaniel in his expensive suits or Grace in her nun's habit, but of them together on the porch of the mountain lodge, older and gray-haired, and laughing Nathaniel's arm around Grace's shoulders, both of them looking at something beyond the frame, looking toward a future they built with their own hands. Beneath the portrait, a plaque bears Grace's words from her journal. "We were not heroes. We were simply two people who chose each other when the world said we shouldn't." And every year on the anniversary of the Great Blizzard of 1888, the foundation hosts a gathering on the mountain. Family comes from across the country, workers and volunteers, people who have been helped by the programs Grace and Nathaniel started. They stand together in the snow and remember. Two fugitives who became legends, a killer and a healer who became partners, a mountain king and a sacred dove who feared no winter because they faced it together. The story endures, the legacy continues, and the snow still falls on the Bighorn Basin, covering the peaks in white eternal and beautiful, while the wind sings through the valleys, a song of survival and love and choices made right.